So welcome to the first of two lunchtime discussions here at the Climate Engineering Conference. My name is Jesse Reynolds of the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands, and today we will discuss will climate engineering unduly hinder emissions reduction, discussing the moral hazard. Nomenclature aside for a moment, the question as to whether the mere discussion or the research or the potential implementation of climate engineering would reduce emissions cuts has loomed in the background of essentially all discussions of climate engineering. But the question remains as to whether this is a mere shadow or a boogeyman, or if this is some sort of monster about which we should be genuinely and seriously concerned. So what we're going to do today is have a relatively open discussion on this matter. Our five panelists, whom I will introduce in just a moment, will begin with brief opening statements. I have a few questions of my own, and then we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. My request from the audience is that you keep your questions and, if you must, comments brief. In the neighborhood of less than 1 minute would be ideal. And we'll see if we can keep this conversation moving and on track. So why don't I introduce the speakers as they do their brief opening statements. We'll begin with, to my immediate left, Martin Bunzl, Professor of Philosophy at Rutgers University.
Thanks a lot, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. Well, Jesse just said we can make a distinction about the question of moral hazard as it arises with the question of whether we should do research on geoengineering, whether we should seriously contemplate its implementation, and whether we should actually implement it. And for any of you who, like me, are non-scientists who have been sitting on some of the technical panels today, I think the overwhelmingly interesting implication is just how complicated the research is showing the question of geoengineering to be in terms of its unanticipated theoretical knock-on effects. And I think one should keep that in mind. To think about moral hazard from a historical point of view is to embed oneself in the Middle Ages and to understand its origins in the context of whether or not insurance should be offered to people and whether or not insurance offered a moral hazard. Moral, in those terms, is not the way we understand it today. It's understood from much more a psychological point of view rather than an ethical point of view. And hazard is understood in its original terms of moral hazard in terms of the notion of a person, in a sense, acting against their best interests, acting out of a kind of weakness of the will. Important thing I think to realize is that moral hazard as it arose then is not a moral notion. And if we look at it in the 19th century, when it takes on a coloration much closer to what we have in mind, there too it's not a moral notion. In the 19th century, the idea of moral hazard arises when a party, an individual, suffers an increased probability of taking risk because his or her actions are not subject to costs that are borne by him and her. It's simply a displacement of costs which distorts the decision-making of that individual qua risk. It's not a moral notion. The question I think we need to address is whether or not, when you ask this question about geoengineering, the questions, to echo Ken yesterday, are any different from the question of moral hazard as it arises in any and all sorts of areas of public policy. Governments regularly sponsor research to counter the effects of ill-advised actions, even if the programs under contemplation have the unintended effect of encouraging those actions. So we see it in the context of immigration policies, which have the unintended effect of encouraging immigration, in terms of HIV protection programs that encourage inadvertently dangerous sex, insurance programs, emergency relief, and I would say it arises even when we consider the notion of adaptation programs to the effects of climate change. So in all such cases, I think the question is whether or not the program that's being contemplated would have a net negative effect, all things considered. And I want to say that I think that's not a conceptual question, it's a straightforward empirical question. But it is an empirical question that has to take into account not the general effect on the population, but the effect on decision makers. And what gives me pause about this is a conference I was at with Ken Caldera about 8 years ago in Washington, when Paul Wolfowitz, architect of the Iraq invasion on behalf of the United States, came in and sat next to us to listen about geoengineering for 5 years. Now, if you're worried about moral hazard with regard to decision making and Wolfowitz is involved, yeah, you should be worried. But more generally, I don't think, as a matter of course, at least at this early stage, the idea that geoengineering represents a moral hazard, qua the analysis I've just given of a net negative effect, really is something to be taken terribly seriously. Now, I've been offering this in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, and maybe you'll take issue with that. But if you do follow a cost-benefit analysis in this regard, as I'm inclined to do, I think it is crucial to understand the question of cost-benefit qua its context. Whenever you do a cost-benefit analysis of a social program, you have to decide the frame at which you're assessing the costs and benefits. Is it narrow or wide? And I think one of the lessons of discussions of geoengineering is that we don't contemplate its potential effects, both good and bad, in the widest context in which we should. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Martin. And next we will hear from Alan Robock, who is Distinguished Professor of Climatology at the Department of Environmental Sciences, also at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Alan.
Thank you very much. So this is the Rutgers delegation along with Bob Kopp here. I'm not an expert in moral hazard, so I just, I have, as a scientist, I have trouble just giving opinions which can't be tested, not testable hypotheses. So, but if you're interested, I'll just give you my opinion. I think that it's probably a negative moral hazard. That is, I agree with what Jane Long said yesterday. When you tell people, what do you think about geoengineering? They say, what's that? And you explain it to them and they say, you're trying to do something that crazy? You're contemplating that? Maybe it's a real problem. Maybe global warming is something we should really worry about. And I think bringing attention of the problem of global warming is probably a good thing through geoengineering research and publicity about it. I had the same experience in the 1980s working on nuclear winter, the climatic effects of nuclear war. And we discovered that fires from targets would produce so much smoke that it would cause huge climate change and make it very cold and dark at the Earth's surface. And people in the United States said, well, why should we care about that? We're all going to die anyway. And then they said, oh yeah, we're all going to die anyway, aren't we? And it made them think about the direct effects of nuclear weapons, and that the number of weapons kept going up and up and up. And both Gorbachev and Reagan are quoted as saying, I heard scientists, both Russian and American ones, telling us about nuclear winter, and that caused us to change our mind and the nuclear arms race. And it was a huge controversy at the time whether nuclear winter was right, and it brought up the subject of nuclear weapons in the first place. So I think in this context, actually, geoengineering, and even if there are disputes about it, although I don't know anybody that really thinks it's a great idea to implement it right now, disputes about it, talking about it, reminds people of the problem of global warming. And with the exception of the country where we're sitting now, not many countries in the world really are doing anything about mitigation, certainly not in the country I come from, or the one north of me, which Canada, which is taken over by the oil interests, and Australia also recently. So sort of the trend's going the other direction. And so I think just discussion of this and the fact that so many of us are taking it as a serious problem and thinking about what we could do, I think will be a positive effect, not a negative effect.
Next up at the far end of the table is Professor of Law Albert Lin from the School of Law at the University of California at Davis.
So let me just briefly sketch out the case for why we should worry about moral hazard, or what I really think is as much a problem of risk compensation. Now, with respect to geoengineering, I think the moral hazard analogy is a bit imperfect. If we think about the insurance context, the heart of the moral hazard problem is this divergence in interests between the interests of the insurer and the insured. That is, the insurer would like the insured to take full precautions, and the insured, because he or she is insured, will not take as many precautions as she otherwise or he otherwise would have. Well, if we try to translate that to the geoengineering context, it doesn't map on perfectly. That is, we might say, well, the insurer consists of the policymakers and the public, perhaps. The insurer, perhaps, is the governmental body that sponsors geoengineering. But unlike in the insurance context, there's an overlap in the identity of the insurer and the insured. So we can't just say, well, let's just focus on the policymakers, because the policymakers aren't making these decisions in a vacuum. They are doing it, at least hopefully, partly in response to what the public desires. Now, does this mean there's no problem if this really isn't as much about moral hazard as it is a problem of risk compensation? Risk compensation is the tendency for people to behave in riskier ways in response to measures designed to reduce risk. So when people put on seatbelts, they tend to drive faster and more recklessly. When snowboarders wear helmets, they tend to get into more accidents. The worry with respect to climate change is that geoengineering research and development will undermine support for mitigation either at the individual level or at the societal level. That is, to some extent, we are relying on individuals to take actions. At least we're hoping individuals will take action to reduce carbon emissions, but we also want policies put in place by our policymakers. Now, admittedly, we're not doing much mitigation now, but I think pretty much everyone agrees that mitigation ultimately is essential. So the key question then becomes, does geoengineering make us worse off with respect to future mitigation? Does it make it less likely we will mitigate in the future? Will geoengineering make it harder, politically or otherwise, to enact effective mitigation? Or will geoengineering reduce the amount of mitigation that we might do? And how might we think about this problem? Well, let me suggest 3 reasons why we might want to worry about this. First, at the heart of both moral hazard and risk compensation is the presumption of the rational actor. That is, we assume that people respond rationally to incentives. And so the decreased exposure to climate risks, if we do geoengineering, will presumably lead to increased risk-taking. Now, you might say on balance, if you do a cost-benefit analysis, which we might want to disagree on whether that's the way to go about this, but assuming that we do, you might say, well, overall, if things aren't as bad, then we ought not worry about moral hazard. But I think the critical question is the perception of reduced risk. And that brings us to the second reason that I think we ought to worry about this, is the psychology of risk perception. So if we consider biases and mental shortcuts that people use, I think that they suggest that people will tend to perceive geoengineering as an easy solution as opposed to mitigation. So there's literature regarding optimism bias and overconfidence bias. That is, with respect to technologies like geoengineering, perhaps we can come up with a techno fix. And even though we don't have the perfect solution now, perhaps if we do a few years of research, we will get there. Geoengineering also provides potentially a sense of control that mitigation does not. That is, mitigation, one of the big problems with mitigation we've had is that it's subject to collective action dynamics, both at the individual level. Why should I bother walking or biking rather than driving when everyone else is driving? And at the national level, why should the US bother to do anything if China's not doing anything about it? And there's also just plain old procrastination. Geoengineering allows us to postpone actions that would be more immediately painful to us. Why not do it instead of mitigating? And then the third reason to worry, I think, is the risk of what I would call political hijacking. Powerful interests have an incentive to promote geoengineering rather than mitigation as a solution. Now, obviously, we might think, well, okay, there's contractors and the like who might have lucrative economic opportunities. In addition, we have plenty of carbon-intensive industries who have a incentive to prefer business as usual. And it's not just carbon-intensive industries, individuals, society. We all have, I think, incentives to prefer the business as usual scenario, and politicians as well. Politicians focused on getting elected, it'll be easier to point to geoengineering and to say, we don't need to mitigate today. And so because geoengineering is susceptible to framing as a magic bullet, whose flaws and obstacles may be dismissed through calls for further research, we ought to worry about it, or worry about it and the risk compensation effects. On the issue of negative moral hazard, I hope Alan is right. But let's think about what's happened with respect to adaptation. Adaptation, like geoengineering, tells a scary story about climate change. This tells us there will be massive floods that will wipe out Bangladesh. It tells us about more superstorms. Did that scare people into mitigating? In addition, I would suggest that information, if we think about what cultural cognition studies have suggested about geoengineering, suggests that the folks who are most receptive to geoengineering are the folks who are more skeptical about climate change. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those folks embrace mitigation. Rather, they say, well, we ought to do geoengineering in consequence. So I think we need to think about these effects, at least be worried about them, rather than just plunging into geoengineering.
Thank you, Al. It's actually a very optimal segue into our next introductory speaker. Nicholas Pidgeon is professor of environmental psychology and director of the Understanding Risk Research Group at Cardiff University.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak and take part in this really interesting session. I mean, the moral hazard question has been there really since the start of any serious discussion of geoengineering as a set of technologies. And I suppose as a social scientist, I would ask the question, you know, where's the evidence for what moral hazard might be? Even if we had the evidence, how would we actually, or how would we interpret what the evidence said? So in the back of my mind, how would you test deterrence theory? Now, maybe the political scientists and the conflict people have a good answer to that question, and they can tell us that deterrence theory has worked. Maybe, I don't know. But you can't do an experiment very easily with that. Equally, I was just thinking, there are plenty of well-known solutions to obesity which don't cost you much money. But having those known in the public domain doesn't stop people becoming obese. So, I mean, just having a solution doesn't necessarily mean that people will either become more alert to the issue or necessarily change their behavior. I think things are more complicated than that, actually. And of course, the reason why we're in this mess in the first place is a set of practices, structures, consumption patterns that are extremely difficult to change. And therefore, how would a simple technical presumed solution change some of those in fundamental ways that would change the sustainability of the Earth? On risk compensation, I was absolutely right. I guess I'd say this as a psychologist, that the question of how people are perceiving geoengineering, how they see the risks, the benefits, under a complicated set of scenarios, because as we know, there's no one thing as geoengineering, so you have to kind of start to then unpack what that really means for people, is something that we can research and will give us a clue as to what might happen. I would say with the risk compensation research, risk compensation it's contested, isn't it? I think the evidence isn't sort of one way that risk compensation is there under all circumstances. So why should it occur here in comparison to other domains? On moral hazard, one point we've made in a paper that's just about to come out in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, if you do have to make the distinction which has been made here, I guess, between individual moral hazard, so how I might change my personal behavior, what we call social moral hazard, which is how we think others might behave, which is quite an important thing, and then political moral hazard, which is how the power structures will respond to knowledge of this new technology. And I think, if researching this question and its interaction with the different publics out there. So we've heard the cultural, which I absolutely agree. I mean, I think Dan Kahan and the cultural cognition work is very interesting. All the work in Europe that's being done on climate skepticism, and I'm trying to understand the difference between people who believe climate change is a very serious problem and people who don't, clearly shows that there's going to be an interaction between those three levels of understanding of moral hazard and where you sit initially on the climate change issue. And I think, to me, those are the interesting empirical questions that sit alongside the philosophical debates about moral hazard.
Thank you. Finally, will be Steve Rayner, who is a professor of science and civilization and the director of the Institute for Science, Innovation, and Society at Oxford University. Steve?
Thank you. I don't know about moral hazard, but there's certainly a hazard in being the last speaker on a panel when most of the points that you've made have already been covered by others. I would note I'm actually particularly grateful to Martin, I think, for some of the technical background and history that is given here, because I think there is often confusion about this term, and people talk about moral hazard to mean some kind of moral problem associated with geoengineering, rather than interpreting it in terms of this much narrower technical meaning derived from the history of insurance. I would just note again something I referred to yesterday, which is that we've been here before, and Professor Lin's just mentioned adaptation. But as somebody who started his career in climate change in the mid-1980s, I have to say that for a very long time, any discussion of adaptation at all, I would say up until the last seven or so years particularly, was dealt with exactly the objection that if we even discuss adaptation, this will discourage people from engaging in mitigation. I've often used the analogy since at the time I was living in the southern United States with conversations with Southern Baptists about sex education in schools. We don't want to even talk about it, because, sex with kids, because it will encourage them to continue to engage in bad behaviour. I think there's been no evidence whatsoever that I have seen that since, and in fact at that time, adaptation was referred to as being morally wrong. Al Gore in his books described it as lazy and evil, I think. So I don't know of any evidence that indicates that since we've recognised that adaptation is an inevitable part of the climate response agenda, that this has had a negative impact on efforts for mitigation. So I think, you know, the closest analogy we have within the field of climate change is something we should look at. And indeed, I think there is it is lamentable that it took us so long to get round to talking about adaptation, because it means that we've made a much later start on that, and many more vulnerable populations, both human and natural, will suffer greater impacts because we delayed so long in getting round to it. That's not necessarily an argument in favour, by the way, of geoengineering, but it is one about, let's be very cautious about embracing this idea of moral hazard. I think with respect to implementation, it's almost inevitable that geoengineering would affect mitigation at the costliest margins. In other words, where you've got very expensive mitigation measures and you've got what would inevitably be fairly expensive, and you've got perhaps slightly cheaper than the very expensive mitigation measures, forms of geoengineering, there may well be some trade-offs there. But the real question is whether the combined impact of mitigation and whatever geoengineering is implemented is greater than the impact that you could get with mitigation alone. And that's the calculation that we would have to make, I think, not whether or not mitigation, I think it's silly to say mitigation, that geoengineering would have no impact on the level of mitigation efforts. Of course it would. The question is, as I say, it's whether the combination of the two are greater than mitigation alone. With respect to research, will research alone have a negative effect on mitigation? I think there's very little evidence to suggest that's true. There was some small pilot research that was done. Andy Parker, who's in the audience here, was involved in it by the Royal Society working group in the preparation of the Geoengineering the Climate report, which in fact did suggest that self-identified climate skeptics were more likely to be concerned about and to respond with mitigation measures to climate change if they saw governments and firms taking seriously the issue, sufficiently seriously to actually spend some money on it and to engage in this work in these technologies. Of course, that's extremely limited empirical base, and I think, as others have said, this is ultimately an empirical question, and clearly one of the things that needs to be done is much more research, in fact, to establish what the empirical base is. My last remark, though, is that I think we can't really discuss this question of moral hazard without the other side of the coin, which is the slippery slope argument, which is frequently advanced by people who also express concern about moral hazard. And it's interesting that they entertain these two incommensurable arguments at the same time, which I think, by the way, is the normal human condition. We all do that all the time. But the slippery slope argument that says basically that if we actually do the research, that this will set us on an inevitable track towards implementation of mitigation. Now, I would argue against that patent offices are in fact the graveyards of dreams, and that patent certificates are usually death certificates for technologies. In fact, we think that we only use everything that human beings invent because, of course, we only see the technologies that have actually survived and been implemented. But I think that there is clearly a set of concerns here which, in a sense, are the mirror image of the moral hazard argument, and they are also expressed by people who have concerns about even the research into geoengineering technology. So I think just note that as part of the context of our discussion.
Thank you, Steve, and to all of the panelists. I'm only going to begin with one question for the panelists, and I'm going off of what Steve brought up about sex education. The social conservative fear of sex education, for example, is that it will increase a certain immoral activity which they disapprove of. Yet support for sex education is that it would decrease another unwanted outcome, which might be, for example, unwanted pregnancy and transmission of diseases. So to what extent does the moral hazard question around climate engineering reveal divergent desires as to what we want to get out of climate policy? Are there varying goals? To what extent mitigation of emissions reduction is the end versus a more, let's say, consequentialist matter of to what extent are people harmed and how can we reduce that?
Could I just say?
Yeah, feel free to throw something out as well, yes.
I'm not sure how to answer that question, but I just wanted to make the point that we talk about, is geoengineering a moral hazard? What do we mean when we say geoengineering? Do we mean research? Do we mean the idea that it will work? I mean, it doesn't exist, and so bringing up something, it might actually, the research might prove how risky it is and how much more dangerous it would be to implement it than not to implement it. And so you can't just say the idea that somebody thought that of this technology that doesn't exist that might work is going to make us not worry about mitigation. It might make us worry about geoengineering and mitigation, and that mitigation would be a safer way to deal with it than trusting this one planet to this technology built by humans and run by humans. If anybody's been in a car lately, and you probably had your seatbelt on, so you understand this concept of things built by humans, operated by humans, cannot work properly. And so would you trust the whole planet to this untested technology? I think that the idea of it, that people are thinking about it, might work to make people more afraid of the initial problem rather than say, okay, I'm just going to wait and let people solve the problem that way, I'll stop worrying about it.
Yeah, as an anthropologist, one of the things that has always been of interest to me is the very diverse motivations that people have, either to support or to oppose the climate change action agenda, and particularly greenhouse gas emissions mitigations. Among those multiple motivations, there is an element who sees basically the carbon stick as an instrument with which to beat industrial society, particularly the more industrially advanced nations, the wealthier nations, into a more egalitarian political, to embrace a more egalitarian political orientation, to redress a lot of the developmental inequalities that exist between the developed and the developing world, for example, and so forth. There are also those who feel very, very strongly that we live in a society which overconsumes commodities and so on, and would like to see a high level of voluntary frugality.
Yeah, we could turn some of these lights down.
Within society, in the notion that, in fact, there is an ethical obligation to consume less. Now, one of the things that geoengineering might be seen to be doing is to take that, potentially to take that carbon stick away from those parties whose part of whose motivation for supporting climate greenhouse gas emissions mitigation is in fact that kind of behavioural change agenda driven by other kinds of ethical considerations. So I think that is something that needs to be taken into account.
Let's go with
Well-
Al. Oh, if we get Al's next. And then,
If I could touch on your question to the extent that it deals with this question of moral. I mean, I think I agree generally with Martin regarding the history of the concept of moral hazard.
You could use the microphone.
I generally agree with Martin regarding the history of the concept of moral hazard is not so much involving morality. But I think in this context, it's hard to separate that question out because at the bottom, right, if we're asking the question of should we just mitigate, obviously with adaptation as part of it, or should we do somewhat less mitigation plus geoengineering, I think that is a question of moral responsibility, right? And I don't think that can be completely divorced from this question. I mean, maybe if you do a strict cost-benefit analysis, all you do is say, well, whatever's the cheapest, do whatever's optimal. But you know, I don't think that can be divorced from this debate about how we go forward.
Well, I like the sex business in the South. I like the sex business of the house. Of course, those parents were operating under the delusion or illusion that their kids weren't having sex to begin with, and somehow sex education would give them the idea. But what I also like about it is that it does, in fact, incorporate a deeply moral strand. And I think it is, as Al said, worth talking about putting the moral, not back into moral hazard, but putting the moral into moral hazard. Here I commend, if you haven't read it, the work of Steve Gardner, also Dale Jamieson, who I think have both in very beautiful ways talked about geoengineering as just one more chapter in the human attitude of a technical and manipulative attitude towards nature. The reason in my writing I've been unsympathetic to that is the same reason I'm unsympathetic to what I consider the kind of delusional attitude that's expressed by people, including some people at this meeting, that if only we would put our minds to renewable energy and quell our demand, everything would be fine. And it's that versus geoengineering, which to my mind totally ignores the reality of prospective, developing world energy demand in the next 100 years and the knock-on effects of not satisfying that demand, including population growth. And I think that it's important, if we are going to talk about the moral hazard of geoengineering, qua a moral theory, to put it in the broad context of worldwide development, worldwide human rights, and a realistic attitude towards the prospects for renewable energy development over the next 80 years.
okay. We'll go to Nick and then questions from the
Well,
audience.
and just briefly, yeah, I think all the history of complex, both technological and other hard-fought debates within societies globally, and the debates are not always the same in different societies, interestingly, around maybe the same technology, which is also worth bearing in mind. They do reveal, one of the elements that comes out is they start to reveal some of the fundamental values. So the whole thing about arguments about risk, when they get really, really nasty, are not really about risk at all. They're about other stuff that's underlying. And it may differ across countries. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as well. Or it does differ across countries, I should say.
Okay, great. So let's see if we can get questions from the audience. So what I'll try to do is to do one question at a time. Keep your questions short, and
One question at a time.
and we'll see if this works out. I'm going to go front to back with the three that we have up. There's Andy, and then Andrew, and then the other hand next to Andrew with the maroon shirt. So yes, let's begin there. Yeah, and then 4.
Hello, thank you. Andy Parker, IASS. One formulation of moral hazard is a description where people feel insulated from risk. They take action which might expose other people to risk. And I'm wondering if there is a form of moral hazard which doesn't often get discussed with respect to geoengineering, and that's where Western elites feel insulated from the risk of climate change. So they take action to delay the development of geoengineering, thus exposing faraway people and ecosystems to the risks of climate change. So I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Responses.
Well, I want to clarify what you're asking. Do Western leaders embrace geoengineering or avoid geoengineering?
No, so where they avoid geoengineering because they feel insulated from the risks of climate change.
Do you have any evidence of that?
No, and again, it's a speculative idea about moral hazard, but one that's not discussed very often.
My view, and to be shameful about it, in a book that has just come out that analyzes both Western and non-Western leaders, is that we operate under an illusion that people are making political decisions for global reasons, when in fact people are making political decisions for narrow, parochial, self-interested reasons that usually have to do with their national or sub-national kinds of interests. I would put it a different way. I think all world leaders today operate under an extreme discount rate with regard to future generations that distorts their attitude, including their attitude towards adaptation, mitigation, and geoengineering, rather than being a contrast between them assessing their interests versus the other interests of people nationally, internationally.
Okay, no further thoughts here. So we'll go to, if the microphone could go to that corner, we will begin with, I believe it was Andrew, and then the gentleman in maroon next to him. There. Andrew,
No,
sorry,
back there with his
back next to the
hand
wall,
up.
hand up. Thank you.
I'm interested in the existence or non-existence of conventional moral hazard in geoengineering. I've not seen any more evidence that moral hazard is any more real than is chemtrails. And we don't spend a lot of time discussing chemtrails because we widely agree that it's not actually true. But yet, despite the plethora of evidence that we've had the opportunity to collect about the potential existence of moral hazard, as far as I'm aware, there's not one shred of evidence that moral hazard does exist in this field at all. In fact, every single study I've seen seems to find again and again and again that negative moral hazard is actually more likely to be real than positive moral hazard. So isn't it just time to stop talking about moral hazard because it's flying against the weight of evidence?
Okay, I think we have a few
Well,
responses.
I think the situation's a bit more mixed than that, Andrew. In my introductory remarks, I expressed skepticism about a lot of the moral hazard argumentation, and I stick to that. On the other hand, I think one does have to bear in mind, you do have, for example, I can't remember their names now, but you'll all know who the super freakonomics authors are, for instance, who have published Levitt and Dubner. Thank you, Levitt and Dubner, who have in fact argued that if the sulfate aerosol technology means that we really needn't worry about mitigation at all because we can solve everything with a solar umbrella. We also have some prominent US politicians, including a former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, who has similarly made those kinds of arguments. So I think there is a danger that there are certain people of political influence who certainly would make arguments about the potential of geoengineering that most of us would find to be extremely optimistic and which can give a false impression of the scope of what geoengineering actually has to offer. So I think it's a little bit more mixed than you're suggesting.
Can I add an example? Australia's environment minister. Enthusiasm.
Any other comments on that question?
Yeah, I mean, this is just a good reason to distinguish the different levels, and I think it's at the political level that you can probably amass plenty of evidence to show that it's quite difficult to keep politicians' feet in the fire either in the electoral cycle or in systems that don't have electoral cycles, where there's less accountability. Either way, you don't win. So that's where the interesting questions lie, and why it should still be on the agenda as a debating point. I don't think that it's a reason to forget about it.
I mean, my understanding of the literature is that it's a bit of a stretch to take what studies have been done out there and to say that there's no moral hazard. I think some of the studies have suggested that, well, some people are equally supportive of mitigation as they were beforehand once they hear about certain types of geoengineering. But those types of geoengineering, I think, tend to be what we might consider the softer types, the ones perhaps less susceptible to being framed as a silver bullet or magic bullet against climate change.
And I'm not aware of anybody in the United States that pays attention to what Newt Gingrich thinks about geoengineering.
That's because, like many other of by the way, I am also an American citizen, although you won't know this from my accent. And I declare my interests. I'm a registered Democrat, as I imagine Alan might well also be. And we know that within the US, basically, we now have a situation of political reticulation where the two political wings actually don't talk to each other. So no, you wouldn't encounter Americans of a divergent political opinion, would you? Doesn't mean to say it's not there.
Okay, we've got next in the queue the microphone to go to the gentleman in the maroon T-shirt near the back corner.
Thank you. Steve Romanello, Arizona State University. So I'm going to try to play devil's advocate a little bit, just because everybody in this room, it's a geoengineering conference, and we're probably all kind of biased. Hopefully you'll play along. So this gets to the slippery slope idea. So when we talk about sort of the choices and design decisions that we make over the next 20 or 50 years, we talk about that like we have a clear view of the advantages and disadvantages of adaptation versus geoengineering. But most of the time when you end up building or designing something, what happens is that you have some choices, and it's not clear necessarily that one set of choices gives you an outcome that's better than another set of choices. So I'll give you an example like an iPhone versus an Android phone. Right? They're very different devices. It's not clear whether one's better than the other. So do we run a similar risk with geoengineering where it might be down the road we can either adapt or geoengineer? It's not clear which is better, but that by opening up a geoengineering alley, it sort of does kind of push us in that direction where at least we see an alternative path that may or may not be better.
I'm not sure that the analogy holds because
I'm sure that it doesn't.
The iPhone and the Android essentially are providing very similar services to the user, even though the technical basis for providing those services may have significant differences within terms of information technology. Whereas I think actually that adaptation and geoengineering, if I can continue to use this language, actually provide us with different services.
Well, I think there's a more general issue that you're raising, which is all of the decisions we face have enormously long lead times. The decision to build a comprehensive infrastructure of renewable energy to satisfy demand is a decadal, if not century-long kind of enterprise. And at least with regard to carbon capture, even if we work out the technology of a more efficient way of capturing carbon from the air, the actual infrastructure would take many decades to roll out, as would planning enough nuclear power to satisfy prospective demand using non-fossil fuels. So what's unique, it's not that it's unique, but what is especially difficult about this area is that they involve decisions under extreme uncertainty, some of which have high risks associated with them. And that's a very difficult policy decision for politicians to be made. And I think some of the most interesting comments made at last night's evening session that we all should be thinking about is the problem of trying to channel this policy issue through the eyes of politicians whose horizon of decision making is incredibly short relative to the public interest.
We'll go there, and then I'll be able to take it there, and then a couple more questions.
Thanks, Duncan McLaren, Lancaster University. I'll try and be brief. but I'll mention some ongoing reanalysis of IAGP transcripts. So this is UK public engagement, which I believe shows very clearly both a limited negative moral hazard and a very strong positive political moral hazard, people attributing to others, particularly politicians. So I think there is some evidence there that we can explore. And in that, people see the moral hazard as a risk that politicians will renege on their obligations or their existing commitments. There's another dimension that I want to ask a question about, which is seeing moral hazard as a transfer of risk onto the future. And I think that this is clear. This is potentially the case given the uncertainty that climate engineering techniques may not function in the way we expect them to. And that politicians, as you said, Martin, have a very short time frame, and SRM is often perceived or presented as a technology which can be implemented over a much shorter time frame than any of the other options, including mitigation and adaptation. So therefore, I'm worried that there is a risk that politicians will, wanting to delay the decisions, will say, there is one thing we can do in the future, so we don't need to do anything now. Then we get to the future, they have limited their choices, and that may not function. Could we hear about this dimension of, is this a risk transfer from us to future generations?
Well, I think those are both brilliant points and highly relevant. I mean, I think there's an extension of what you said, which is a certain attitude among some scientists. It's summarized, to my mind, in a disturbing way in the American Physical Society report, in which the suggestion is that geoengineering may well be a solution, but it's a solution for future generation scientists to address. And so I think there's an attitude among scientists that this is a problem that can be put off to future generations, just like with politicians relying on the prospect of it, as you suggest, and putting it over. So I agree with you.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple more. Let's just go 1, 2, 3 down this here, starting in the front, the gentleman in the light blue shirt.
Right.
Yes.
Oh, here.
Yeah. And then 2 rows behind him, and then 1 row behind him in the darker blue shirt.
I was interested in Nicholas's division of a sort of hierarchy of arenas in which one might consider this name moral hazard, which I think it's an unfortunate name, but we're stuck with it for today. But I'm more interested in the more aggregated arenas of the social and the political, which is where I think it plays out, and I think Martin thinks the same thing, that this is where it plays out more tangibly. And I think it has to be understood both dynamically and historically. So earlier on, geoengineering was presented as a thing in a sort of fairly heroic sort of way, which gave it a sort of rhetorical strength in a political contest over climate change and how we are to respond to it. And organisations like the Copenhagen Consensus Centre and the American Enterprise Institute and other such organisations heavily funded by fossil fuel interests tended to advance geoengineering, and I think it was very much in a look. Let's divert ourselves. Here's a way we can capitalise on the huge fossil fuel reserves that we have in our possession, and at the same time address the issue of climate change. At the same time, holding the view that climate change wasn't really there. It seems to me that the outcome of that battle is not yet clear, but that the rhetorical resource of geoengineering has to be understood in the context of that battle. I'd be very interested in the comments of Nicholas and others on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely, and that's why when I said it's about values, it's about other stuff as well. So you have to try and understand the social context. A good example is think of the split now between Republicans and Democrats on climate change in the US. Interestingly, there are some Republicans who are quite happy with the climate change idea. It's only a minority within there. But the split is nonetheless there if you do the polling data. And then you have to then ask yourself, why did that occur? And it was actually traces back to about the second Clinton administration, and when they were starting to talk about the environment, and Al Gore as well, looking to the next election. Then suddenly, it appears, organized interests became interested in this question as a political weapon in the argument with the Democrats. So the history of it is and that's why we need historians as well to try and understand what's going on in different social contexts. Germany, a completely different political context. I don't know if anybody wants to comment upon that from the perspective here. UK, we tend to sit between America and Europe and have a slightly different set of culture drivers, although we're quite close to the US in some respects. So yeah, I just agree with what you say, but need to understand the historical and political context surrounding a key risk debate in society, of which this is one. Why has it become so fraught?
Okay, we'll go to Alan and to the next two questions if we have time.
Just very briefly, I mean, this reminds me of the comment that was made yesterday evening regarding, well, we need to emphasize that geoengineering is not an option now. And I think, I'm sorry. Reminds me of the comment last night regarding emphasizing that geoengineering is not an option now. And the question is, who will say this? Will the politicians say that? And who will listen to this? And will we listen to this? Will the politicians listen to this? And if so, what's the implication? I mean, if we really think it's not an option now, what are we going to do about it? And I don't think the politicians want to face up to, well, I think it suggests we need to do some mitigation.
Okay. Yeah. He in the gray.
Thank you. It's a very good discussion.
You need to speak into the end of the microphone.
Into the end?
Can't be heard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How's
like
that? Better?
Like a rock singer.
Thank you. One comment I want to make is how powerful the opposition. The reason we don't have a coherent program on geoengineering research in the U.S. government is the fear of slowing our emissions reduction effort, because the main reason we don't have a program is political, and that's what sits behind it. And so this moral hazard question of whether geoengineering would hinder emission reduction, I think it's operative. I think it's really there. This fear of that geoengineering is an alternative answer. And so we don't have a robust debate about how all the pieces fit together. And
Okay.
there's a political, it's difficult for politicians who care about climate to talk about geoengineering.
Okay.
Very difficult.
In the interest of time, I will leave that comment there, bundle it with the brief comment or question from the gentleman behind, and then our panelists may respond.
Well, I'd like to say that, you can't stop scientists from thinking. You cannot fund them. You can slow down their research, but they can still get their ideas across. And if you want to control what the politicians are doing, what their possible response might be, then it's their behavior that you're worried about. You should be working on the politicians.
Yeah. So, assuming climate, the moral hazard is a problem, what can be done? Final thoughts?
Well, I'm not convinced yet it is a hazard, but I think my final thought, contra a comment Alan made in his opening remarks, is that this is open to empirical study, and it's open to empirical study at all levels. And I'd emphasize what Nick said and the gentleman said from the floor down there, which is the really interesting area we need to study is the attitude of individual constituents towards this and the knock-on effects of that on politicians. And it is possible to do game simulations with politicians and arrive at relatively robust empirical results about this and move forward with that in mind.
It's been my experience in the U.S. that very few people know anything about geoengineering, and you can't really have a conversation with people without explaining to them what it is, including politicians, I think. I know that John Holdren, the president's science advisor, was asked when he took office 6 years ago that what do you think about climate change? And he said, we've got to look at everything, including geoengineering. And the report by Seth Bornstein was that President Science Advisor is in favor of geoengineering, when what he really said was, I'm in favor of geoengineering research. And so people, they got sort of afraid because of that. And as Rafe said, they really hasn't been any federal policy on that. However, there is a lot of research money being spent in the United States on geoengineering research through the normal channels of the National Science Foundation, NASA, and so forth. There's no ban on doing the research. I've participated in several NSF grants that fund the research. So there's no ban on it. It's part of the climate research program that's already going on. I hope that when the National Academy of Sciences report on geoengineering is released later this year, the first U.S. national study, that it will stimulate more research and more research programs. And maybe that's going to happen soon, but I don't see the fact that there are national programs in Germany and UK and Norway doesn't mean that it's not going on other places. So it's going on. I don't see that it really has affecting mitigation policy either in the United States. I think it's sort of such a minor issue, although all of us are involved in it, but I don't think it's really part of the debate in the U.S. I don't see that.
Yeah, let's quickly move down the road.
Just briefly, all I just want to comment, because we do a lot of work on public engagement, obviously, and one thing that comes across very clearly, that the point about scientists will still think. All the public groups that we've talked to have always said, you must allow scientists to think about, because these are significant public problems and science may be able to help in whatever way. Where people become concerned, it is what you would do at the deployment stage without adequate controls, so what it then leads to. So I think allowing scientists to think, that it's clear that should be an objective of all of us, because it's such a serious problem we're talking about, the whole energy, climate, population nexus, which comes together in the environmental question we've got here. Doing responsible innovation, doing public engagement, trying to understand how the public are thinking about this, there's no evidence to say they would not want you to be thinking very deeply and seriously about these questions.
I think that one of the things that we sometimes lose sight of in our discussions, because we are engaged with the topic, is the fact that at the moment geoengineering technology doesn't exist. We're still at the stage essentially of technological imaginaries, concepts. And I think that at this stage of the game, the idea that we shouldn't be thinking further about this and trying to explore them because of the concern about moral hazard is a misguided point of view. If we look at other areas where there are big threats to humanity, have we seen situations where scientific research has resulted in major problems? You know, if you think, for example, does AIDS research encourage sexual immorality? I don't think so. Or sexual promiscuity? I don't think so. So I think that the evidence that this is a problem for us at the moment is relatively thin, and I think there are much bigger governance issues associated with geoengineering that we need to be paying a lot more attention to than to the issue of moral hazard.
I mean, I think the AIDS research issue is a little bit different. Because if we're concerned primarily, it sounds like from our discussion today, if we're concerned primarily about the effects on politicians, it's not clear what the effect of AIDS research is on politicians' sexual preferences. But as to Jesse,
but does it affect their approach to health policy, public health policy? Excuse me.
Well, it may. With respect to Jesse's questions regarding what we can do about it, I mean, I think there's a couple possibilities we could think about. One possibility is to focus our efforts on methods that are less likely to present moral hazard problems, on techniques that are less likely to be viewed as a silver bullet in an inaccurate way. Another possibility though I think this would cut both ways, would be to link funding for geoengineering research with funding for mitigation or the extent of mitigation efforts. Now, I think it could, as I suggest here, I'm not absolutely sold on that, but it's something to think about.
Okay, great. So, noting that our next session begins in 11 short minutes, please join me in thanking our participants.